Hi everyone, my name is Samantha Hill and I am the Assistant Director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities. Welcome to our virtual reading group. Can everyone hear me okay? And Susan, you're nodding your head yes. Bob, good. Okay. So, bit of a different background today. I'm in New York City in the middle of a conference. So we're going to end around 2:15 today instead of 2:30, so I apologize for shorting you the 15 minutes in advance, but I'm sure that we'll have lots of time for discussion. So today we're going to be looking at Hannah Arendt's essay, Action and the Pursuit of Happiness. This was originally given as a lecture in 1960 at the American Political Science Association conference. If you are doing a little research online, you can go to the loc.gov website to Arendt's archive, and you can actually see her annotated version of the lecture notes, which is really neat, what she crossed out and added. I posted the first 2 pages to Twitter this morning, but that is just trivia. So Arendt gave this lecture in 1960, 3 years before she published before she published On Revolution. In this essay, we see this is the problem with being in New York City. It's not a revolution breaking out; it's just traffic. Sorry about that. Hopefully, that won't happen again. So I'm going to keep talking if everyone can hear me. In this essay, which isn't horribly long, we see a number of the primary themes that she focuses on Revolution coming out. The relationship between action and happiness, the question of thinking, the difference between private happiness and public happiness, and the way that she's thinking about what it is the men of letters, the hommes de lettres, Madison and Jefferson and Adams are doing during the American Revolution, and fundamentally what happens after that revolutionary political moment. What happens to the politics of revolution once it's time to start founding political institutions? She talks about this space between the revolutionary moment and the constituting moment. And for her, in between those two movements in the revolution, something essential is lost. Something essential is lost. What On Revolution she's going to come to define as the lost treasure of the revolution. And in this essay, I think we get a really nice, almost even personal example of the way that she's thinking about that lost treasure of revolution and what it is and what it has to do with thinking and what it has to do with happiness and spirit. I think this is a really beautiful talk. She begins the piece by giving us a rather big question. What is the relationship between action and happiness? And in order to begin to tease that out, she's going to spend the first part of the essay thinking about personal political experience through a kind of anecdotal framework. She starts with a discussion of thinking and how our experiences in the world inform the way that we think politically about certain questions. And then in the second half of the essay, she's going to lead us down a more rigorous theoretical path in order to think about the distinction between private happiness and public happiness and that lost treasure of the revolution, and how we as citizens might reclaim some of that public happiness through civic participation and engaged citizenship. Today, it's, I don't think, very common to automatically associate the idea of happiness in any form with politics. I wake up in the morning, I look at the news, and I feel like I'm getting punched in the face. And even when I show up to vote, it doesn't often feel very celebratory. And this is incredibly unfortunate. And for Arendt, the way that we think about our own participation in the public realm, in the political sphere, has a lot to do with how she's thinking about happiness. in a really essential sense. And it's a kind of happiness for her which is constitutive of freedom and the public sphere and an engaged citizenship. So she starts us off with this question, and I just want to read one sentence from the first paragraph where she says, "My purpose is much more modest. It consists in raising the question of a possible relation of action to happiness in an effort to discover the authentic, non-ideological background of experience behind this bewildering pursuit." This passage really stuck out to me as I was reading, because she uses this phrase, which she doesn't use very often in her writing, which is non-ideological, because she's trying to get at a form of political experience that is more fundamental and not reliant upon a kind of subjective experience which carries authority in and of itself. The kind of experience that seems to be dominating so many of our contemporary political discussions today. Instead, she's interested in a different kind of political experience, a collective political action. And that's what she is going to begin to tease out here. So she asks, what does the phenomena of action have to do with the relationship between action and happiness? She says that the phenomena of action, the fact that we can appear in the public world and that we can engage in speech and action, and thinking and speech are forms of action for her, are elementary human activities. And then she moves to this question of, she phrases it on page 202 as incidents of living experience, right? So our experiences, our lived political experiences, become guideposts for the way that we think and the way that our thinking takes its bearings from the world around us. And this echoes in a lot of the writing that she does on thinking and what she's taking from Kant in a certain sense of this idea that we go wandering. When we go out in the world and we engage other people in conversation, we hear viewpoints that aren't our own. We come into engagement and dialogue with individuals who have different opinions. And when we experience the world, that creates a plurality in our own thinking, which is fundamental for the way that she's thinking about politics. And so she starts with this anecdote, and it's this kind of fun anecdote, and I want to just take a look at a bit of it. She says on page 204, the incident that kind of set her off thinking down this path, she says, which gave rise to the following considerations, was as follows. I was engaged in a conversation with one of those former radicals, communists, Trotskyites, and the like, whom I suppose we all count among our acquaintances and friends. And I was curious how this particular person viewed his own past, how he had come to terms with his former convictions. At the back of my mind, I had the ready-made alternatives into which the answer was likely to fall. And then she goes on in this paragraph and she gives two different possibilities for what she assumed his explanation for his former politics might be. I have to say this passage resonated with me in my misspent youth organizing for a Trotskyist socialist organization, which is a different story. But then on the next page, she says, to my surprise, I wish my answer had been as good as this one. The answer of my acquaintance differed from all these expectations. Instead of a straightforward reply, I was told a story. The story of an inveterate gambler who happened to arrive late in a strange town and naturally proceeded forthwith to the gambling place. There, a native approached him and warned him that the wheel was crooked, whereupon the stranger replied, but there's no other wheel in town. The moral of the story was clear. In those days, my acquaintance implied, if you had the itch to do something, you had no other place to go. You went there not for the good of society at large, but for your own sake. And even if you went for other, presumably more honorable motives, such, for instance, as we know from the French Resistance, it could happen to you that once you were in it, you would discover that there no longer existed that épissure triste between the world of reality and yourself. that trying to save your country, you had first of all saved yourself. Many indeed, if they had the courage, not of their convictions, which is relatively easy, but of their experiences, courage of their experiences, should know what the French poet and writer René Char was talking about when during the years of war and desperate action he wrote, "If I survive, I know that I shall have to break with the aroma of these essential years, silently reject, not repress, my treasure, go back to the very beginnings, to my most destitute behavior, when I was in quest of myself without mastery, in naked unsatisfaction, in barely perceptible knowledge, and inquiring humility." So I want to pause there for a moment. This passage from René Char is actually one of my favorite passages in all of Arendt's writing, and it's a passage that she comes back to time and again throughout her work. She ends on revolution with that quotation. She begins between past and future with that quotation, and she also begins the book on thinking with that quotation. René Char was a French resistance fighter, and the passage that she's quoting is taken from his diary, which is titled in English Hypnos Waking, which he kept during the resistance. It's a collection of poetry and fragments, and it's remarkably beautiful. I'm not sure if it's in print anymore, but if you can get your hands on it, I highly recommend it. And Char here for her comes to represent the embodiment of the lost treasure of the revolution. He espouses poetically what one is moved to in that moment of collective political action. And I want to take a second, and I have On Revolution in front of me, and I want to contextualize the way she ties this to her conception of action in the final pages of this text, which is also how she's going to end this lecture as well. She says, "This and probably much more was lost when the spirit of revolution, a new spirit, and the spirit of beginning something new." There we have that idea of new beginnings, which is so fundamental in Arendt's work. It's the idea of promise and future, failed to find its appropriate institution. The spirit of revolution failed to find its appropriate institution. There is nothing that could compensate for this failure or prevent it from becoming final except memory and recollection. And since the storehouse of memory is kept and watched over by poets whose business it is to find and make the words we live by, it may be wise to turn in conclusion to two of them, one modern, the other ancient, in order to find an approximate articulation of the actual content of our lost treasure. The modern poet is René Char, perhaps the most articulate of the many French writers and artists who joined the resistance during the Second World War. His book of aphorisms was written during the last year of the war in a frankly apprehensive anticipation of liberation, for he knew that as far as they were concerned, there would be not only the welcome liberation from German occupation, but liberation from, quote, the burden of public business as well. Back they would have to go to that épaisseur triste, that opaque sadness of their private lives and pursuits, to the sterile desperation of the pre-war years, when it was as though a curse hung over everything they did. Quote, "If I survive, I know that I shall have to break with the aroma of these essential years, silently reject, not repress, my treasure." The treasure, he thought, was that he had found himself, that he no longer suspected himself of insincerity, that he needed no mask and no make-believe to appear, that wherever he went, he appeared as he was to others and to himself, that he could afford to go naked. These reflections are significant enough as they testify to the involuntary self-discourse, to the joys of appearing in word and deed without equivocation. I think it's a lovely example of the way in which Arendt is a brilliant poetic thinker working through Char's language in order to offer us a really material and intimate portrait of what it means to genuinely engage in the public realm, to appear before one another without that kind of mask of persona that we're often performing, but to feel called and moved based upon certain political principles to participate in public action. And when we participate in public action in that sense, we're when we participate in public action in that sense, we're somehow no longer performing our social functions, but we're entering into this space, which she describes as a gap space, where there is a relationship between happiness and action. And seems to be something that perhaps we are wrestling or trying to find a way to reclaim today at this political moment. So in the essay that we read for today, she develops this in the second part in order to think about how, in the American context, we might be able to preserve the lost treasure of the revolution. So she traces the kind of literary lineage of the founding fathers, of the men of letters, and talks about why they go back to the ancients to see what kind of political institutions were at play. And then she gives us kind of two primary points in the second part. One is a focus on Jefferson's attempt to establish councils or ward systems, right? The town council system or the ward system, Arendt saw as the real possibility for preserving not so much the original goal of the revolution, so much as the spirit of revolution, that lost treasure that invigorates us and arouses us to participate in action in the public sphere, which inspired the revolution in the first place. The ward system or the councils provided institutionally a way for individual citizens to actively participate in their government and to feel like they had a stake in the political decisions that were being made. And the second point that she talks about is happiness as a kind of virtue. That we might be able to rediscover. But there is this kind of note at the end where she seems somewhat, returning to Shar, she seems, I think, a bit, hesitant or reticent in the sense that this is difficult, right? We live in a political reality where much of the tradition of politics and morality that once provided a center for political action has fundamentally been destroyed by the emergence of totalitarianism in the 20th century and by, I think, other elements of our political culture today. So I am going to stop there for a moment and see if there are any questions. Howard, I can't hear you. I see that you're trying to talk, but I can't hear you. Still can't hear you. Dan?
I believe he's unmuted. Now he's...
I can hear you, Dan. I couldn't hear Howard.
Yeah. Howard, make sure your mic is not muted on your end. Sorry, Howard.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
This is Bob.
Hi, Bob.
So I agree with you that actually even the idea of public happiness is a strange one. It seems like, okay, private happiness, and I always thought that's what Jefferson was talking about. The idea of public happiness never even occurred to me until I read this essay.
Yeah.
So, so I'm still trying to get my arms around it. It strikes me as the poem by Renee Chard is kind of like the excitement one gets when you hear people go, they went to the military, they served in Vietnam with their friends, they're shooting people, or could get killed, and there's all this kind of excitement about being together in the revolution or the military or something. But then it ends, and then they go back home, and then they become a school teacher, and they have these social roles. And so I don't know if I would want to be in perpetual revolution. It doesn't sound too attractive to me, even though it might be exciting. I think we need to find a way to have some kind of stability. Yeah. But I don't see a way to have this kind of public happiness available in the life we live. It just seems too like out there. I don't see an opportunity for that. I suppose the only way you have a public happiness is when people get together, form a corporation, make a lot of money, and then that's more private happiness. But there is some sort of joint effort going on. That's the only place I see it happening. Or maybe people form something like the Hannah Arendt Center or something like that. Maybe that's where it happens. There's some sort of
well, we do have a lot of happiness at the Arendt Center. I will say that, mostly because we have an amazing team of people, but and members. But so the kind of corporation example that you give it would be much more in line with the kind of way that Arendt is conceptualizing private happiness. And she's drawing a distinction between private happiness and public happiness, I think for an important political reason. She's not advocating for a constant state of revolution, which she says in this essay, citing, Jefferson's call to rewrite the Constitution every so many years. Instead, what she's trying to do is think about that spirit of engagement which propels people into the public political realm during moments of revolution, that spirit that animates the public realm. And then what happens once it's necessary to found a government. So she has this great passage in On Revolution where she says, 5 minutes after the revolutionary, the most left-wing revolutionary will become a conservative. And that's because revolution is not a stable political situation, and we need a stable political situation. Much of political theory is dedicated to thinking about political stability contra forms of tumult and chaos from Machiavelli and so onward. What Arendt is really getting at is trying to think about ways in which that spirit, that animating spirit of politics, can be, I'll use the word enshrined within our extant political institutions, right? So instead of constituting a republic where once the institutions are in place, citizens no longer have a role or meaning or responsibility in relationship to the governing of the republic, how might we incorporate that spirit of political participation into the public and political institutions that we have collectively as a people, right? And this is very different than the idea of private happiness, which is, I have enough wealth, I go home, I'm with my, family, and I'm, cooking dinner or whatever, and, enjoying the private realm. This is a different idea of happiness for Arendt, which is different than the public one. I think it's really difficult today to, I know it's difficult for me, and it's difficult for me to teach it in a way that I see my students receiving it in the classroom. It's difficult to teach an appreciation for our political institutions, to think about the ways in which citizens can play an active role in politics. We have this talk by David Van Raybroek, which is up on YouTube now. I think Dan can perhaps post a link in the chat box, who is doing work on innovative democracy and sortition. And he's starting to do these direct democracy forums in different parts of Europe now, which gathers citizens together to have vigorous discussion about key political issues like the environment and public policy and healthcare and universal income, so that they can have a more direct voice in the decisions that are being made. A lot of individuals today feel very alienated from the political institutions that we have. I think this was a big theme that emerged out of the 2016 presidential election. A lot of the people who voted for Trump said that they were disillusioned with the political institutions because they saw them as these concretized, halls of politics that were completely cut off from everyday people who don't feel like they have access to civic participation, like their voice doesn't matter. And I think that's a big part of what Arendt is trying to advocate here for, is a kind of smaller Republican democracy that gets individuals more actively engaged in political governing.
Well, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can still hear you.
So I agree with that. I think, at least in my experience, it's very hard to talk. Like my mother always said, never talk about politics or religion because you're bound to get into a fight if you do, and it will lead nowhere. And that has been my experience, actually. So we don't have a framework in which we can talk about politics and enjoy the conversation. We can talk about politics and hate the conversation and say, I'll never do that again, but we don't have a framework. So I do like the idea of creating a framework in which people actually can talk about differences, with the idea that we're not going to actually end up throwing beer cans at each other.
Yeah, so I just stepped out of at a conference in the city at the Heterodox Academy, and the whole morning was dedicated to thinking about ways in which we can promote that kind of conversation, specifically on college campuses, to move away from these discourses that are entirely centered around power and I'm going to win and I'm going to beat you over the head with my opinion until you acquiesce or we end up in a fight, but instead where we could perhaps have a principled conversation about politics that's more interested in truth and sharing opinions and disagreement in a vital way. That encourages conversation. And I think that's, something that a lot of people are very actively trying to create right now. It's something that we're trying to do at the Hannah Arendt Center through a number of programs that we've instituted on campus in the past couple of years in response to this calling out, shouting people down culture where it feels like political discourse has been completely taken off the public table, which,
Yeah, I
I'm
agree
gonna
with
jump
that.
over. I'm gonna jump over to the chat box. So, Bob, what is the difference between public happiness and simply an enjoyment of exercising power in public office? The phrase exercising power in public office it feels very stark somehow, and that might be because of our contemporary political context. But I think in Hannah Arendt's parsing in this essay and in the work in On Revolution, the idea of public happiness doesn't have anything to do with power in politics. And she says in a number of places, politics and truth are at odds with one another, and power is destructive in certain ways of the political realm. She does talk about power in the revolutionary sense, in the sense that it's something that we pick up in the street collectively when we act together in concert. And so if we think about that kind of power of engagement where we act collectively, I think that's a different kind of power than what I read in the second half of your comment about a politician who's been elected to public office and who is doing what he wants on behalf of his constituency or not. It's not about the power to implement public policy. It's more about public discourse and collective political action in the public realm for Arendt. And it's a feeling of, I'm not sure this exists in politics anymore, but I think there is an idea that, politics is a vocation. Politics is something that you're called to do, that you have a sense of civic responsibility, and it comes from a kind of moral center. It's to have a sense of political virtue. And that seems to be something that we're fighting for today.
I'd say if you replace happiness with satisfaction in public service, you're closer to the truth, because I think that's the real public service. People going for the real stuff. They're not. It's not happiness as we understand it, personal happiness. It's more that
Right.
I did what I thought at the time. I think about getting back to the the ongoing revolution that Jefferson wanted, and the real revolution that she does point out that Robespierre would not give up the revolution for fear of losing that connection that people had with things. I think I've read other places that Jefferson was disappointed that there was not more included in final work about more support for protest, the idea of protesting without going to revolutions. And I think I'm not a historian, so I can't point you to any texts. But I think he wanted the ward system was the reflection of it, having more input
Right.
up. But I think he wanted really more ability to protest, protection for protest, to avoid isolating people that happened in 2016 as we kind of analyze it now.
Yeah, to avoid isolating people, and also to have to that I think authority has something to do with it here. That political institutions take on a certain kind of authority without voter participation or input, and that's, I think, essential to democracy. The division of powers between the levels of government are a way for citizens and the government to hold decisions accountable. And I think Jefferson and Arendt are both interested in creating political spaces where citizens can hold the government accountable for the decisions that they are making on behalf of the citizens that shape their everyday life. The essay that we talked about, I think the last time I was leading the VRG about the election, and she was talking about I think it was at the Kennedy election. And her complaint, if you remember, was that the political parties had essentially removed the candidate choice from the voters by becoming institutional mechanisms in themselves. So then at the delegation meetings, the political parties would just tell the voters, okay, you can choose A or B. And the voters were cut off from having a voice in who the candidates were. So I think that she's interested in opening up these spaces for civic participation so that we can, as citizens, hold the government accountable and have a sense that we have a stake in the policies that are being crafted.
I'd like to come back to my distinction.
Yes.
Somebody who's in political office has to work with his or her caucus or across the aisle. So there is a collective sense. And we also see how some former elected officials jump at the chance to take a cabinet post.
Sure.
And they do that because maybe, they're tired of cooperating. And it gives them the ability to lay down the law. So as far as the exercise of political power goes, maybe power isn't quite the right word, but it seems to me that it can also be understood as kind of the apotheosis of collective action. You act collectively in order to achieve certain goals, and then when you're in political office, you're still acting collectively to achieve those goals, but maybe you just have to compromise more.
So I think you certainly have to compromise more. I think there's a question about the space between this kind of revolutionary spirit of citizens gathering together and acting collectively. So Occupy might be an example of that. It's a troubled example of that. But citizens who, go in the street and try to pick up power and to use it to call attention to political issues that are affecting the government, and how elected representatives and officials engage in politics and exercise political power. And I think Arendt's interested in the space between the two. I think there can be public happiness in the sense that she's describing it materially in institutionalized politics. I think it's in short supply today. That's my own political opinion. It doesn't seem like there's enough engagement or vigorous debate. But I think there's also a question about what moves us to get involved with politics. What calls us to participate in the public sphere. Have you seen Aaron Sorkin's The West Wing at all? Aaron, during the Clinton administration, Aaron Sorkin created a make-believe president because apparently the country needed one. In that sense, I think he created an ideal portrait of a form of politicians engaging in public happiness. It feels as a kind of moralizing show, but I was reaching for an example where I could imaginatively offer you an example.
I'd like to. Oh, sorry.
Bob? No, go for it.
Yeah. So one of the things that hasn't shown itself here is the impact of corporations on our political process. I don't hear Aaron talking about that very much, but if I'm like a corporation and I've got multi-billions of dollars invested in something or other,
yeah,
I'm interested in stability. I don't want change. I don't want the public getting involved and making radical changes in what I'm doing, because I could lose billions of dollars and my stockholders will be very unhappy. So my guess is that corporations like it this way. Who needs the public? They're going to be very radical. If you look at Socrates and say, what happened there? Well, Alcibiades went out and did all kinds of stupid stuff and destroyed the Athenian democracy. And who needs that? I think corporations want things stable and controlled. They don't want a lot of public participation, which could radically change the direction of the country. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the way you're thinking about participation in that sense. Crises is actually really profitable for corporations within a capitalist system. There's a reason the stock market rallies every time there's a mass shooting, or why it rallied after Donald Trump was elected, which lost a lot of people some money. That a certain amount of instability is actually quite profitable. And I think from an economic perspective, I think that is related to and slightly separate from the ways in which our traditional public political institutions have been slowly privatized since the 70s in the United States, beginning with the Nixon-Reagan administration and the relaxation of the antitrust laws. It's not a coincidence that shortly after that we reached a point where we had mass economic stagnation in the United States, where most working and middle class citizens have actually not seen a rise in their income since that time period. And I think that's created this great sense of political disparity. At the same time, a lot of Sheldon Woolen makes this argument quite explicitly. Arendt doesn't go here, you're getting me now, that the police, the prison system, the education system, the healthcare system, and so on have all essentially been privatized through the federal government. And I think that has certainly shaped a lot of the political questions that we're looking at today. That was also the primary objective or aim or target of the Occupy movement and of Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential campaign, to draw attention to the way money is affecting politics. I think that has alienated a lot of individuals from participating in politics. At the same time, since 2016, I think we've seen a real reinvigoration of politics at a local level. That the election of Donald Trump, in a certain sense, was so jarring to a lot of individuals that we've seen a spike in political participation in local municipalities and states. More women than ever are running for political office. The midterm election is certainly interesting to follow at this point. And last year, we actually witnessed the largest amount of citizen participation and protest activity. Around 3% of all Americans engaged in a protest activity last year, which is really remarkable. So this is one of the premises of our fall 2018 conference, Citizenship and Civil Disobedience. We're witnessing, excuse me, a mass reinvigoration of public participation. I think it's cutting a lot of different ways. That was a lot of answer.
Well, it's probably the crisis of Trump plus the awareness of other social situations, women's rights, and so on and so forth. I think the combination has affected what you just.
So I'm going to jump over to Caroline's comment in the chat box. She writes, the Nordic model, which I don't know anything about the Nordic model, I'm just going to say that right now, provides its citizens with a great deal of security, happiness. The security or happiness, or security is there with happiness. Social democracy.
They supposedly, with these world things that they do, where they do the survey, they say the Nordic countries are the happiest. But I have a little problem with that, in that what they really provide is a level of security.
Do you mean economic security?
Security, as in, when I grow old, will I be poor and destitute? No, I won't,
Sure.
because my government takes care of that.
Sure.
If I get sick, will I go bankrupt? No, I won't be, because my government takes care of that. Will my children be able to get a fine education? No, that won't happen, because my government takes care of that. This is a lot of security, and some people equate that with happiness, but they also have a tradition, the Ting tradition, which is parliaments, small and large, are very strong in the Nordic model. There are smaller countries, more people have a voice, and towards pragmatic solutions of what the people need. So to say there can't be political or public happiness, I think we have a role model here in the Nordic countries where a lot has been achieved. And I'm sorry you don't know more about it. You should study it.
There are so many things that I have to study. It's endless. I always feel understudied. Arendt talks about, not in this essay, but she certainly talks about it in On Revolution, and she talks about it in her essay on the end of tradition and the promise of politics, the relationship between economic security and individuals' ability to participate freely in the public realm and to engage in politics. She has this kind of controversial line in On Revolution where she says it was only by virtue of slavery in America that the founding fathers were actually able to found the republic. But in the essay on the end of tradition, she's talking about the polis, and she's talking about how the household provided a form of social stability and private stability so that individuals were free to engage in politics. So she doesn't collapse the two in upon one another. They're radically different for her. Economic security and how she thinks about the social question is different from the way that she's thinking about public happiness. In a certain sense, you could argue that that form of security or economic stability comes before our ability to engage in the public realm of politics. And that's a fairly common argument, I think, among political theorists.
As I understand it, Arendt really argues for having a voice within a community, and that is the essence of being a real person who counts. And am I wrong to say that that would be public happiness if people felt they had a voice within a community and that their voice counted?
So I don't know, right, wrong. So we appear, right? We appear phenomenally in the world, and she talks about this a lot in The Human Condition, in the sense that you're talking about it right now, in the chapter on the public and the chapter on action. We appear in the world, and we are recognized by others through our speech and through our actions. And she talks a bit about the etymology of the word hero in The Human Condition, which then just meant that anyone who deserved to be remembered. So everyone, through their public speech and their public actions, had the right to have their story be told. And that's a form of public and political recognition, which for her is necessary for humanity. In Origins, when she's talking about the terror of the concentration camps, one of the reasons they were so horrifying was because they literally erased the appearance of individuals in the world so that they were unable to appear, and so, in her terms, be fully human. So we require that ability to appear in public, to speak, to have our opinions heard, to hear other people's opinions, to engage with one another in that sense. Howard, you wrote in the box since your microphone isn't working, so I'm going to read it. When I read the essay, I could not help but think about the Zapatista revolution in Mexico, which is now in its 27th year and still going strong. It is an inspiration for many movements in Latin America, which are being suppressed by the government. I wonder, as Arendt students, we should not study these contemporary events as elements of a model of her council ideas or as one of several models of her idea. I am going to reveal another deficit in my historical education, which is I do not actually know how the Zapatista revolution is being run at a kind of a day-to-day basis. So I'm not willing to make that kind of comparison. I certainly think that it's worth looking at contemporary political movements to think about ways in which individuals are getting engaged in politics at a local level and trying to influence government. In the United States, groups like Black Lives Matter, Occupy, I think are doing interesting collective political work. I don't know if your microphone's working now, if you want to say something about the Zapatista revolution. I'm sorry I can't speak to it more articulately. No. Okay. When you see me in person, you can tell me. The microphones. Bob followed up, another thought, might the experience of public happiness be surprising to oneself, development of the discovery of who one is, better yet, or who one is becoming? I think so. I mean, I think that this is a really, that one of the things that Shar captures in the Hypnos Waking is that he was certainly surprised and quite sad to have to let go of this feeling. And he describes it so eloquently, this idea that we can appear before one another as ourselves without any of the pretense of society or how it is we should or ought to conform in public, but that we can exist in a state where others see us for who we are, and that exists beyond the kind of confines of identity, and I think is much more in tune with a conception of becoming, and very close to the way that she's thinking about what it means to think self-reflectively, and to the phrase Shar uses is the ability to, to go naked in public. That idea of persona, wearing the mask in public to appear, gets taken off in these moments of political participation. And we're free in that sense, to be recognized for who we are as individuals.
I'd like to say something about that. I think people in politics want to do that. They want to express themselves and be seen for who they are.
Yeah.
And then another person stands up and they object to that, and they say, no, that's not how things are. This is who I am. And with the way you said who you are interferes with the way I am, and that's where the fight starts. So I think we need some training in actually listening to hear how people are and how they want to be seen without so much criticism. I think this is I think we all as a culture need to develop like a much broader sense of acceptance and honoring and appreciating people for their individuality, and not think of the person expressing their individuality as somehow a threat to my individuality.
Right.
And I think this is
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think that there's something really important there, and I think it's important not to collapse individuality with identity. One of the things that, at least in classrooms right now, teaching or like going to public events, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but a lot of people often begin their whatever it is they're about to say by offering their identity markers. So I just wrote this thing on the Me Too movement, and I was advised by the editor to state at the forefront that, I was a woman who has suffered sexual assault, therefore now I have the authority to tell you what I think about this movement. But, like speaking as a first generation college student and woman, now I am going to give you my political opinion. And we collapse identity with that individuality, where identity almost takes on this kind of, I think, plastic branding. And Arendt is really moving us away from an identitarian-centered politics to a politics that is about political virtue and about a moral center and a conviction to the integrity of one's own thinking and having a fidelity to oneself. So I think it's appearing in that way and learning how to recognize one another and accept one another's ability to have an opinion and to argue that opinion and disagree with it or agree with it or change your mind without constantly being thrown back on this subjectivized authority, which is centered around an identity politics.
Yeah, I agree with that. Oh, sorry.
No, go for it. Bob,
I agree with that, but I wouldn't. This whole idea that there's something like an identity, like I'm a part of the Me Too movement or something, that's your identity. That's, to me, is like such a shallow idea of like who you are as a person. It's like it's like a TV idea or something.
Well, I think, TV's had a lot to do with that's a different conversation, but not far from the truth. Daphne writes, is there not some disdain for that very American ghastly privilege of pursuit of phantoms? Quote on page 201, along with surprise that one can exercise freedom of thought in the democratic process. Let's look at the quote on page 201. Slide up here. So, Daphne, are you looking at the bottom of 201 in that second paragraph? I'm looking for the quote you pulled out. Ghastly privilege.
She quotes Howard Mumford Jones, the ghastly
Awesome.
privilege. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I found it.
The ghastly privilege of pursuing a phantom and embracing a delusion, which is the pursuit of happiness. And it's interesting because it's not a European concept. And then she goes through the whole analysis of this felicity of the pen and what actually was trying to be established here, why we are in America even conscious of the idea that we have to pursue happiness. She talks about how Tocqueville saw this as an American thing. And I think that the essay then goes on to say that if you take away that superficial idea that we're entitled to happiness, I think that's what she's saying, that there is a real serious aspect to it, but you have to remove all the white noise. And then the participation in citizenship is where she sees an overlap between happiness and the public sphere. I think that's what the essay largely is about, but I might be misreading it.
No, I think it's about, I think we've been focusing most of this discussion on the latter half of what you just said. So she starts by saying that this idea that the pursuit of public happiness has actually had a meaningful impact upon the American frame of mind, and that the American mentality has been strongly influenced by the idea that we can pursue happiness. And oftentimes this idea, which has been rendered a kind of political catchphrase or jargon, is related to one's ability to accumulate or to experience private happiness, to get a plot of one's own, which is then why she traces the kind of origin of public happiness through the men of letters, to show where they were actually taking the idea from, and to make her argument for public happiness, which she sees as essential to citizenship.
I'd like to address what Bob was talking about in terms of civility in politics, and also addressing the masking of people that you were referring to. In today's politics, because it's not the door-to-door, face-to-face kind of politics, traditionally, 100 years ago, you would try to meet, if you were running for office, you try to meet as many people as you possibly could at the supermarket, the usual stuff. And nowadays it's television, it's handouts, it's all of that stuff. That's really that's the masking, all this stuff. And when you're doing that kind of stuff, you have to fit the certain whatever the parameters are for that kind of stuff. And so that we probably won't be ever getting back to if you ran for public office a long time ago, you actually, Bob Meyerson talked about collective energy or collegial energy, where you could talk to people and look for commonalities, and you'd see them because that's who they were. They weren't hiding. It wasn't an institution in yourself. You were just a person who did it. We'll never get back to it, Bob. Just that's my things will go. But I hope we would, but I don't believe we
Not
would.
entirely, Pat. In rural areas,
Yeah.
the candidates are out, everywhere they can be.
Yeah.
So this might be a matter of country versus city in part.
Can I say something about that too? I think that in rural or whatever, the idea of the public expression in, say, revolution or public dissent means that you are together with a lot of people who think like you. So you've eliminated the necessity to establish what their political opinions are. You already know. You're in a public sphere. You're all kind of protesting in the same way. Perhaps that's an act of citizenship, which to some extent is a positive thing for you. whether it's effective or not is another thing. As long as the institutions don't recognize it, it's a problem.
Dan? Dan, somehow everything's been muted from my end and somebody is sharing a presentation. Can you fix it,
Kaya?
please?
There you go. Sorry.
Thank you. Nope, that's fine. I just missed the last part of what Daphne said. Sorry,
I don't remember
Daphne.
what I was saying. I think it's just that I'm thinking that that when we have political discourse today, and you were talking about the incivility of political discourse today, a lot of that has to do with the fact that when we're seeing political debates, as we've seen in the past 500 and some days, 600 days, we've seen total incivility, but we've also seen a total lack of informed thinking. Which has been replaced by various acts of gut feeling and power brawling. And I think that where we do protest in us as a citizen is where we've already eliminated the necessity for the discourse, because we're all participating in a demonstration or in a protest at which all the participants basically agree. And that's a problem, because we don't have the immediate necessity for actual informed political discourse. That was my point.
No, I think that is an excellent point, and that we are in short supply of real news reporting. And a lot of political discourse is either contained within a kind of echo chamber, where you find yourself surrounded by people who agree with you, or it is being guided by ungrounded political opinion, which is being proffered and rewarded on social media and on cable news networks. And there are a lot of challenges to opening up genuine public space for political discourse today, where people can come together and engage in dialogue and conversation and talk about important political issues. I think that's one of the things that's so interesting, at least to me, about some of the work that David Van Raybroek is doing. I see Dan posted the video on YouTube if anyone wants to watch it. Really working, and this is a lot of what the Hannah Arendt Center does, really working to open up public spaces where a variety of political opinions can come together and have a rigorous conversation about important issues. I'm going to slide. So that's what Daphne, you just. Joanna, what is troubling is the reaction to citizens' attempt to participate in politics. I mean, those in power. What is troubling is the reaction to citizens' attempt to participate in politics by those in power. The disdain and ridicule by politicians is certainly discouraging to this participation. Arendt believes leads to happiness. It does not. I don't think that politicians discouraging citizens to participate in politics is that's certainly a barrier to engaging in the public in the public sphere. I think that I think I can't remember, maybe it was Bob who earlier was talking about how citizen participation is often dissuaded by those who hold political power. And it's seriously, we're thinking about at an institutional level ways in which politicians want to actively encourage citizen feedback and participation. I think, unfortunately, that comes back around in many ways to the question of money in politics, where a lot of, you talk to a lot of congressmen or senators, and they're constantly running for political office because they have to endlessly be raising money. And they don't have the time to engage with citizens in the way that they should be engaging with citizens. And instead, their whole political career is oriented around raising money and retaining political office. And that doesn't sound very happy to me in the Arendtian sense. Sorry, it's a bad joke. But I think that cuts both ways for both the politicians who are in public office and for the voters that they're representing who may want to get involved in politics. We see a lot of, slide down in the Howard. The Zapatista model is unique as its motto is, here the people decide and the government obeys. That sounds very, I'm going to have to defer to Howard on that because the microphone is not working. The people decide and the government obeys. Well, you know, the Arendt was very fond of talking about Montesquieu and the brilliance of the separation of powers. You know, we have local and state and federal government, and they each perform a vital function, I think, at least in the American idea of democracy. So I'm not sure about the people decide and the government obeys, but maybe I've wandered too far from my old Trotskyist roots to be that much of a socialist anymore. That's what. I'll leave that alone.
This one, can I jump in?
Yes,
The
please,
more I'm listening to this, the more I'm wondering, I guess it feels a little unreal, this idea of citizen participation, when you really, I just wonder how much the participation was in the form of war. And what Bob was saying before about the sense that men have from fighting together in war, and that book, A Terrible Love of War by James Hillman, talks about that. And when even in the French Revolution, one of the big decisions that split the moderates and the farther left was whether to go to war against the countries that were invading. And they made that decision partly because they felt it would unite the public behind the revolution. And so I just wonder how much there really ever has been real participation other than being united in war. And if you look at our country after World War II, I don't know anything about Korea, but we're now maybe looking at that a little more. But certainly by Vietnam and the Iraq War, you know, there was no such thing as us uniting around that war. You know, by not having a draft, they eliminated, you know, some of the movement that was taking place, you know, in the Vietnam War. So I'm just listening to everybody. I'm thinking, you know, and even the issue of the corporations, I think they're usually very much behind a war. I think many corporations benefit enormously from that. And so I'm just wondering what participation there has been other than that.
I think that's a good Brechtian point on the end there. And I think, you know, it's, yes, the Arendt is, I think, materially taking this conception of public happiness in part from René Char and the French Resistance, and in part from the Founding Fathers during the American Revolution. But again, I just to kind of maybe circle back to where we started this conversation, in part is that there's, for her, she wants to really draw a distinction between the revolutionary moment and the spirit of new beginnings, which animates the revolutionary moment, and the stable founding political institutions. And thinking about the ways in which we can embed that spirit of new beginnings, of participation in the institutions. In that sense, if we think about it that way, I think that there is you know, I was born in 1984. I grew up in the Midwest. I went to some private Orthodox whatever school, and I went to public school, and I had to take civics. I took a lot of civics classes, and I took government classes, and I took problems of democracy. And I think that there was perhaps, I mean, in that education, in that public education, there is a sense of civic duty and responsibility that we can instill in individuals to help them feel more connected to the institutions of politics, which literally do give form to our everyday lives. I'm not sure we're teaching civics that much anymore in the United States. I think that we've lost that citizen appreciate, that idea of what it means to be a citizen, and what it means to be a citizen who is connected to the political institutions that are shaping our lives in the United States. And just to even have that material appreciation for our political institutions feels so lost upon, you know, the students that I have coming into intro to American politics, you know, grew up in the under the shadow of the Iraq and Afghanistan war. They've always lived in a post 9/11 world, and they have not learned civics. And this feels like a loss. And I think that's a big part of what Arendt is talking about. Creating that kind of civic engagement, that happiness of feeling connected to one's government, of one's polity, of being able to actually participate and do something. On my 18th birthday, this is anecdotal and I apologize, but I celebrated by driving to the DMV and registering to vote. And I was, you know, I felt proud in that. There was a sense of political engagement, and I'm not sure that, at least in the United States anymore, we have this kind of civic culture which facilitates participation in public happiness.
Isn't Arendt's point?
I do think it exists.
Isn't Hannah Arendt's point that you can't teach civics? In this essay, the experience comes out of experience, not out of ideology?
I think it comes out of experience, not an ideology, but you can education is certainly an experience, and hopefully education is not ideological. You know, depending on where we grow up and, you know, where we come from and all that, but our personal experiences, privately, socially, publicly, politically, shape the way that we think about politics and political institutions. I think ideology in this sense has much more to do with the idea that one is indoctrinated. She actually says I think the essay on education that, you know, that ideology cannot be taught, right? That's like the opposite of the idea of education. She has a strong sense of politics and citizen engagement. And I think I don't recall her saying that can't be taught anywhere. I think that it very much can be. Otherwise, I don't think I have a job anymore. But I think that's a part of the project. I have to end in a couple of minutes, so let me just go back to the chat box. Susan, that's a great question about how public got dropped from the pursuit of happiness. I'm going to look that up. I don't know the answer to it, but I will get back to you on that. I'm curious as well. I don't have it at my fingertips. Carolyn says, anyone wanting to learn about the Nordic model, Professor Lakey has written a concise book that's readable called Viking Economics. So I'll add that to my reading list for the summer. Connell says goodbye. Bob, as an aside note, Scandinavia is not all of a piece. Sweden is not entirely a happiness place. When I was much younger, it had a reputation for high suicide rate. Bergman, I love Bergman. Bergman movies are almost universally dark. Some Swedes carry a sense of inferiority. I was asked by a reporter in northern Sweden, don't you find us dull? I'm telling your story badly. Contemporary films by Ruben Östlund, Avalanche and the Red Square explore the ideas of cowardice, self-doubt, unintended. I mean, so this, Bob, I think that, you know, here there's a really, it might not be what you meant, but there's really, I think, important point. Participation in politics and the public sphere in the sense of action related to happiness gives us a sense of meaning and purpose. This is something that we are fundamentally lacking today as a country. We are experiencing a kind of existential crisis. Suicide rates among young girls alone since the 1990s are up 100%. Across the board, suicide of ages between people 20 to 35 is up 24%. This does not include the drug epidemic. I mean, suicide obviously is something that's been in the media the past couple of weeks. And this is, I think, so essential to the way that Arendt is thinking about public happiness and a community and acting in concert and feeling like you have purpose and that you can appear in public and that you can engage. And this has really been, this is something that we have lost in contemporary politics. Carolyn, yes. I'm not sure what BM stands for. That is why I have a problem with the surveys that dub Nordic.
Bob Meyerson.
Oh, sorry, Bob Meyerson. Countries with the Nordic models provide a certain level of security, a component foundation for happiness, not the whole picture. Susan, also, I wonder if on some level private happiness thought to be privileged by Republicans and Democrats, and public happiness by Democrats, I think also Republicans, or does this framing confuse preference for less government versus more active government? I don't think it's a question of small government versus large government. I think it's a question of participation in government. I think the larger, smaller government has more to do with the public policy debates that evolved out of post-World War II government shifts and FDR, Reaganites, and the way that the government has fundamentally shifted in the United States over time. One of my favorite political theorists is Tom Paine, who's one of the often forgotten founders of the American, or participants in the American Revolution and founders. Perhaps the original political provocateur, pamphleting and provoking the people, was a big advocate for something we don't even have a conception for, which is very small government, economic, and a large social welfare state. But so a bit of a contradiction there in his philosophy, if you read Rights of Man. And then feeling of connections to political institutions and civics. It's interesting to realize that for many people, especially those living in high incarceration communities and neighborhoods, the primary public institution they relate to is, yes, the prison system. Absolutely. This is such a fundamental question in the United States and politics right now, and we have to critically think about reforming our prison system. That's my political opinion. I'm proud to work at Bard, where we do a lot of public education work in the prison system, but this is absolutely a critical and fundamental issue that we're dealing with. Thank you for an invigorating conversation. I'm sorry that I'm ending things a little bit short today. I am happy to make the 10 or so minutes up to you the next time that we meet. And if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. This is one of my favorite texts of Arendt, and I'm happy to talk about it. But otherwise, I hope everybody has a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks a lot, Samantha.
Thank